that King David had a son. One of his sons was named Avshalom. And Avshalom started a rebellion against King David, as he was aware that there are many sons of King David. And of course, he was worried that he wouldn't be in the lineage to receive and to become the next king. So he started a rebellion. He was very good looking. He was very popular. He was a great speaker. So he rallied the people to his side and through deception was able to get a following and eventually crown himself king. And many of King David's loyalists eventually joined his camp, what was known as Camp Avshalom. Now, King David had an advisor who is brought down in the Talmud several times, is also brought in the Pirkei Avot. And in the Pirkei Avot brings this individual is named Achitofel or Achitofel as one of the advisors, one of the teachers of King David. And interestingly, Achitofel actually was the leader of the Sanhedrin, which to be the leader of the Sanhedrin, you had to be one of the greatest Torah scholars of your time, because the Sanhedrin was made up of 70 scholars, and you had to be able to lead them. He was known to be one of the, not just the greatest Torah scholar, but one of the most knowledgeable and brightest individuals to live at the time, to the point that when Achitofel, the advisor of King David, joined the camp of Avshalom, King David actually was ready to throw in the towel, and he said, if Achitofel joined, I don't see how we're going to prevail and persevere and overcome Avshalom's rebellion. Now, there are many reasons brought out of why Achitofel would join the rebellion, how a smart individual such as Achitofel would fall for the good looks and charm of Avshalom, and there are many reasons brought, but we're not going to discuss those reasons right now. Achitofel joins and starts advising Avshalom in order to help him overcome and win over the rest of the people and eventually take over the kingdom of David. Now, King David's few loyalists that he had left, he basically told them, I don't know how we're going to beat them if Achitofel is on Avshalom's side. So there was another advisor named Hushi, that was appointed by King David, and he volunteered to defect over to Avshalom's side. Obviously, he'll still be loyal to King David, but he'll try to advise Avshalom against Achitofel in order to sort of trip him up a little bit or slow him down and not allow the winning advice of Achitofel to prevail with Avshalom, which will eventually lead to the overcoming of the kingdom of David, which was a very scary thought at the time because Avshalom was young and he was reckless and he was wild and he was obviously not in it for the right reasons. So it was a very daring task, and he undertook this role to go advise Avshalom against the advice of Achitofel. So he arrives at the camp and he says, I'm with you guys. I'm totally committed to you. I'm going to help you get rid of King David. Let's get rolling. Now, Achitofel realized that King David is still very powerful and still very influential. So he was advising Avshalom to attack King David right away with everything he had, so that way he'll overcome King David before the rest of the people know what's going on. So Hushi says, wait a second, don't do that. You really should wait until, you have more support. And he gave him a bunch of reasons why he should slow down. And he was very convincing, even though it was the wrong advice, and Avshalom accepted Hushi's advice against Achitofel's advice. And when Achitofel realized that his advice is not being accepted by Avshalom, he realized what's going on, and he realized that the rebellion is lost. He was that smart and he was that forward-thinking to know that if Avshalom is not recognizing the brilliance of his advice, then there's no way this rebellion is going to succeed. And at that point, there was really nothing left to stay on for and to try to navigate or can stay on as an advisor of a losing campaign. So what did he do? He went home and he took his own life. Now, before he took his own life, he left a suicide note. And the Gemara in Sanhedrin brings this text of the suicide note, which is really interesting. Not just interesting, but mysterious. What are you saying? And the Rebbe writes a letter explaining the interesting ideas that were left by Achitofel in the suicide note, and that's what we're going to talk about. So here's what the suicide note said. He wrote, number one, this is to his children he was writing, do not engage in arguments. Do not engage in machlokas, in any type of controversy. Stay away from it. Stay away from arguments. Stay away from any sort of anything that could be divisive amongst people. Stay away. Number two, never rebel against the kingdom of David. And number three, this is the interesting one, when the weather is clear, on Shavuos, plant your wheat. Now, what's puzzling about this suicide note is that the last thing someone who's about to take his own life, especially someone like Achitofel, who was one of the smartest human beings to live at his time, and one of the greatest Torah scholars, to talk about planting wheat, it's so not relevant. Like, why would you leave that in this note? The first two make sense, even though the second one is redundant, because if you're not engaging in machlokas, if you're not engaging in anything divisive, well, obviously you're not going to rebel against the kingdom of David. So the first and second one seem redundant, and the third one seems totally irrelevant. Why is that important? Why are you giving advice, farming advice, to your children on the eve of your own passing? So the Rebbe writes in a letter dated from 1949, explaining the depth of the advice Achitofel was giving his children, and he brings the quote from the Pirkei Avos, the ethics of our fathers, in the Mishnah, where he writes that there are three crowns. There's the crown of Kahuna, the crown of the priesthood, the crown of Malchus, and the crown of Torah. Malchus means kingship, and he explains like this. The first piece of advice, which do not engage in arguments, is coming from the general sense of keep your ego in check. Very often, when we're very passionate about something and emotional about something, we let our emotions take control, and the emotions guide us, and very often they guide us in the wrong direction. And Achitofel was giving his children a very understandable piece of advice: do not let your emotions take over. Do not let your feelings overcome the importance of decision making, because the idea of which we learn in Hasidus, the idea that the mind controls the heart, is to recognize that emotions are not necessarily reliable. That yes, they're very powerful and very moving, and they help us, help propel us to our goals, but at the same time, they could also lead us astray if we're not using our intellect to control it. That's number one. And the crown that would be referred to in that first advice is the crown of kahuna. What is the crown of Kohen? A crown of priesthood. What's the idea of a Kohen? A Kohen by nature is kind. A Kohen by nature has to show in his genetics that he is a kind individual to other people. And the idea was that they were the ones that provided the service in the Holy Temple, because they were able to recognize the value and the responsibility that they had to be the servants of God, which kindness is obviously one of them. So why would Achitofel give the next piece of advice, which seems redundant? Do not rebel against the kingdom of David. Obviously, if you're not going to engage in controversy, then rebelling against the kingdom would fall into that category. So why would Achitofel include that second piece of advice? So this is where a very important element of the lesson comes in play. How do we make up our ideas of what behavior and character traits we're striving for, what goals we're striving for? As human beings, we have our own logic, our own way of understanding how something should be and what makes sense to us. And we use those principles or those values as a way to guide us in how we're going to make decisions in our life. So we decide this is what's considered just. This is what's considered ethical. This is what's considered right versus wrong. And those principles, usually that we learn as a child through our upbringing, become the foundation for how we live our lives. But there's a challenge with that. There's a problem with that. And the problem with that is that at the same time, most of it's based on our own logic, and it's based on our own conclusions that we come to through our own way of understanding things. And the example given in the Talmud in Sanhedrin is that the king before King David, King Saul, committed a sin where he did not wipe out the nation of Amalek as he was commanded to, and therefore the kingdom was ripped away from him. What happened in King David, as we all know, King David committed also a pretty bad sin, and the kingdom wasn't ripped away from him. Which is why Achitofel, in his logic, understood that there's no way King David could remain the king. Just like King Saul had the kingdom ripped away from him because of his behavior, King David should fear no less. Why should he be allowed to keep the kingdom? And therefore, Achitofel felt confident in his rebellion, because based on his logic and based on his principles, it didn't make sense for the kingdom to remain in the house of David, at least with King David himself. The problem with logic is that if we are completely reliant on what our logic is telling us, we can make a very big mistake, because ultimately our logic is not what rules the world. Hashem rules the world. Hashem decides how things are going to play out and what situations are going to play out. And we are here as emissaries of God to fulfill his mission in this world. And if our logic is usually a good thing, but if our logic is the only thing we're using to define our own principles and our own values, we can make mistakes. And that's why Achitofel added in the second piece of advice: do not rebel against the kingdom of David. Even if in your own logic it makes sense to take the steps that you're taking and to act the way you're acting, remember that ultimately there's a kingdom here. What is the idea of kingdom? The idea of godliness within the world. And that's why we wear the kippah, by the way, to remind us that there's somebody above us. And even though we have logic, even though we have a brain that tells us here's what's good and here's what's bad, but there's something above us, above our logic, that is greater than our logic, that we can't understand. And that is the God-given principles and values that even sometimes when they don't make sense to us, we still are obligated to follow them. And that's what Achitofel was reminding his children with that second piece of advice. Here comes the third piece of advice, where Achitofel tells his children when it's clear on Shavuot, when the weather is clear on Shavuot. We've had very bad weather here in Charlotte, so we can understand the idea that if you have a clear sunny day on Shavuos, that's when you should plant your wheat. In fact, the word Shavuos actually represents the idea of it's when they would go harvest the crop, because the weather was finally giving way for the crops to start to be ripe and to be ready for harvesting, which is why it's known, the holiday of Shavuos is known as the holiday of the harvest. But having said that, what is the unique advice of when the weather is clear, you could harvest your wheat on Shavuos? What's the idea of wheat? Wheat is sustenance, how we sustain our existence. Enjoyable. It's not just what we eat, for the pure sustenance, but we also, tend to enjoy it, which is all fine. Nothing wrong with it. It's all good. But at the same time, when and how do we make sure that what we are participating in and indulging in is correct? Is when it's a clear day on Shavuos, when the day that the Torah was given is not just clear, but it's overtaking your principle, your conscience, that you recognize where the values come from. Only then are you ready to plant your wheat. Only then can you indulge in the world. Can you feel confident that you can exist within the world and you're going to make the right decisions? In other words, use Shavuos as your guiding light. Use the Torah as your guiding light to ensure that your principles and your values and your makeup and your character and your behavior are according to the Torah and doing it the right way. It's not enough to know I'm a good person, I'm a nice person, so therefore, as long as I follow my own feelings of what's right and what's wrong, then I know I'm going to do the right thing, because that's not necessarily going to happen, because ultimately our logic sometimes falls into gray areas and sometimes has the ability to be manipulated or biased towards the wrong things. And therefore, Achitofel was warning his children that in addition to not engaging in controversy, and in addition to not rebelling against the kingdom of David, remember that when do you plant your wheat? When it's clear, when it's a sunny, bright, sunny day on Shavuot, when your Shavuos, when your Torah is clear in your mind, and it's the one guiding light of your mind, and it's the one thing that you recognize is the ultimate truth. Only then can you feel confident to plant your wheat. Only then can you feel confident to sustain yourself and allow yourself to indulge in the world and go out in the world, because you know you are on the right track. It's not enough to use our own logic. It's not enough to trust our own brilliance, which very often we could be brilliant. He was the most brilliant man of his time.